The Ethiopian coffee ceremony is one of the most popular in the world and an important social event that brings communities together. Traditionally, the coffee ceremony is performed by women, who start by washing the coffee, also called buna in Amharic. From Abol, the first coffee, Tona, the second, and finally to Bareka. Then it is done.
Imagine waking up tomorrow morning in the United States and discovering that your beloved morning ritual, the steaming cup of coffee that fuels your day, no longer exists. Not because of a shortage, not because of drought, not because of logistics, but because Ethiopia, the very birthplace of coffee, has said, enough. America will get no more. Do you understand the gravity of that? This isn't just about beans. This is about power, sovereignty, and a new world order. For decades, Washington strutted across the globe, dictating prices, controlling trade, and exploiting Africa's farmers, treating them as mere suppliers for Wall Street and Starbucks. But today, Ethiopia has slammed the door shut. The United States, the world's largest coffee consumer, has just been cut off from its lifeline. What happens when the heartbeat of American productivity, the coffee cup in every office, every household, suddenly goes silent? Starbucks shares nosedive, independent. Close overnight. Workers across Silicon Valley and Wall Street struggle through caffeine withdrawal. Panic spreads, not just on the trading floors, but in kitchens, boardrooms, and even the White House. Washington calls it economic blackmail. Ethiopia calls it justice. Because for decades, Ethiopian farmers lived in poverty while Americans sipped their lattes without ever questioning where those beans came from. 1 pound of coffee sold for $1 to Ethiopia's farmers, then for $20 on U.S. shelves. Who got rich? Who stayed poor? Today, that cycle is broken. And here's the explosive truth: this is not only about coffee. This is a message to the West. Africa will no longer bow. Ethiopia's decision is a domino waiting to fall. If Addis Ababa can choke America's caffeine supply, what happens when Nigeria rethinks its oil, when Ghana reclaims its cocoa, when Congo withholds its cobalt? The U.S. economy, built on cheap African resources, suddenly stands on quicksand. Listen carefully. This is not the story of a crop. It is the story of an empire collapsing, one bean at a time. America's arrogance has finally met its match, and that match was lit in Addis Ababa. Ethiopia, the nation that once defeated colonial armies at Adwa, has now launched an economic revolution with global consequences. So when we say Ethiopia has banned coffee exports to the U.S., understand this: it is not just about denying Americans their morning cup. It is about denying America its illusion of control. It is about shifting the balance of power. It is about Africa rising and the West realizing, for the first time in centuries, that their grip is slipping. Ladies and gentlemen, buckle up, because this is not a minor trade dispute. This is the beginning of a storm that could redraw the global economic map. And it all started with Ethiopia daring to say the one word Washington fears most: no. Ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters across Africa, citizens of the world who have long waited for a shift in the balance of global power, today we gather at the crossroads of history. What has happened in Ethiopia is not just an economic decision, not just a trade disruption, not just an agricultural matter. It is a declaration of sovereignty, a rejection of exploitation, and a turning point in the struggle between Africa and the empire that has sought to keep it in chains. Ethiopia, the cradle of coffee, the birthplace of the bean that fuels the global economy, has made a decision so bold, so transformative, that Washington, Wall Street, and Silicon Valley are trembling in disbelief. Ethiopia has banned coffee exports to the United States, and with one single act, Addis Ababa has struck at the very heart of American cultural and economic dependence. Understand this clearly: America is addicted to coffee. From the streets of New York to the campuses of California, from the White House to the Wall Street trading floor, coffee is not a luxury, it is a lifeline. Over 60% of Americans consume coffee daily. It is the fuel of their workforce, the heartbeat of their industries, the ritual of their mornings. And where does that lifeline begin? In the highlands of Ethiopia, in the soil of Africa. In the hands of farmers who, for centuries, were robbed of their worth while American corporations built billion-dollar empires on their beans. Starbucks, Dunkin', Peet's, McDonald's coffee lines, boutique. In Manhattan, all of them depend on one truth: Africa's coffee flows endlessly and cheaply to U.S. markets. That truth has now been shattered. Ethiopia has closed the tap. The empire's mug is empty. Why did Ethiopia make this move? Because after decades of exploitation, after centuries of unfair trade, after watching the United States dictate terms through corporations, middlemen, and financial institutions, Ethiopia has chosen dignity over dependency. For too long, American buyers paid pennies for beans while charging $5, $6, even $10 for a cup of Coffee brewed from those very beans. The farmers remained poor, while Wall Street investors got rich. The soil was drained, the labor was devalued, and the narrative was always the same. Africa is cheap, Africa is replaceable, Africa is powerless. But today, that narrative has been buried. Ethiopia has shown the world that Africa is not replaceable, that when Africa withholds what is hers, the empire cannot function, that one act of defiance by one African nation can bring tremors to the global economy. The shockwaves are visible. U.S. coffee chains are in panic. Stock markets are rattling. Analysts on CNBC stutter, searching for words as they try to explain to an American public how their morning latte is suddenly a geopolitical crisis. The price of coffee futures is skyrocketing, but this time no amount of speculation, no amount of lobbying, no amount of subsidies will solve the problem, because this is not a shortage caused by weather or accident. This is intentional. This is Africa standing up. Make no mistake, this is not just about Ethiopia. This is about the entire continent. When Addis Ababa declared its ban, it sent a signal from the Horn of Africa to the Atlantic coast. Africa is reclaiming its power. For decades, the United States used coffee as a symbol of soft power, a commodity so embedded in its culture that Americans could not imagine a day without it. Now, that comfort has turned into fear, because they know that without African beans, their economy, their culture, and even their daily routines will collapse into chaos. Think of the symbolism. Ethiopia, the nation that resisted colonization, the nation that stood against Italian fascism, the nation that has always been a beacon of African pride, is once again at the forefront of history. By banning coffee exports to the U.S., Ethiopia is not just disrupting trade, it is dismantling dependency. It is saying to Washington, you will no longer profit from our labor while leaving us in poverty. You will no longer dictate prices while we suffer. You will no longer sip comfort while we sweat in misery. And the world is watching. From Europe to Asia, nations are asking themselves, if Ethiopia can do this, what happens when cocoa from Ghana and Ivory Coast no longer flows too? And Hershey? What happens when cobalt from Congo is processed in Kinshasa instead of shipped cheaply to Tesla? What happens when oil from Nigeria or uranium from Niger is redirected away from Western capitals and toward allies in the global south? The United States is terrified because it sees the writing on the wall. Ethiopia's coffee ban is not an isolated decision. It is a spark. A spark that could ignite a revolution of trade realignments, a revolution that finally ends Western exploitation. America depends on Africa far more than it admits, and now that truth has been exposed for all to see, let us also consider the cultural humiliation. For decades, American corporations built an empire on Ethiopian heritage. They romanticized the story of the Ethiopian shepherd Chaldi who discovered coffee. They used Ethiopian names Yirga Chef, Sidamo, Harer as branding tools to sell overpriced beverages in Western. But the very people who grew those beans lived in poverty, exploited by a system designed in Washington, Brussels, and London. Now Ethiopia has taken back the narrative. Those names no longer belong to Starbucks menus. They belong to Ethiopia, to Africa, to sovereignty. Already, reports emerge of long lines outside coffee shops in America. Panic buying has begun. Prices have doubled, tripled. Workers complain that their productivity is falling without their daily caffeine fix. Some U.S. companies are even exploring synthetic coffee as a desperate alternative. Imagine that an empire built on illusions, now scrambling to create lab-made beans because it cannot face the truth that Africa has cut them off. The U.S. government will try to retaliate. They will threaten sanctions. They will send envoys. They will attempt to bribe, intimidate, or destabilize. But Ethiopia has allies. China has already expressed interest in absorbing the coffee that would have gone to the U.S., India, the Gulf states, and even European nations frustrated. With American arrogance are lining up to sign new deals. Ethiopia is not isolated, it is empowered. And here is the ultimate irony. America always claimed it was protecting free trade. Yet when Africa chooses who to trade with, suddenly it is economic warfare. When Africa asserts its right to set prices and conditions, suddenly it is a threat to global stability. But the world is no longer fooled. The hypocrisy of the empire is exposed, and Ethiopia has struck the first blow in dismantling it. My friends, this is more than coffee. This is about control. This is about showing that Africa no longer exists to feed others while going hungry itself. This is about telling the world that African soil produces wealth not for Wall Street, but for Africans. Ethiopia has shown courage, and in doing so, it has reminded us of a profound truth. When Africa unites its resources with political will, no empire can stop it. And so, let the world tremble. Let the Americans panic. Let their markets scream, because this is only the beginning. Ethiopia has poured the first cup of a new future, and that future tastes like freedom. The story unfolding before us is nothing short of extraordinary. Ethiopia, the proud birthplace of coffee, has drawn a line in the sand and told the United States, no more. This act has sent shockwaves across global markets and left Wall Street trembling, not because of bullets or bombs, but because of beans, because of coffee, the black gold of the morning ritual, the silent fuel of American productivity. Yet what many in Washington call an economic catastrophe, Ethiopians and Africans everywhere are calling justice. To understand why this decision carries such monumental weight, one must look beyond the cup, and deep into history itself. For centuries, Ethiopia has been exporting its finest beans for pennies, while American corporations packaged, branded, and resold them for fortunes. The farmer in Sidamo, Harar, or Yirgacheffe worked tirelessly under the hot sun, only to receive crumbs from a market system designed in New York and London. It was exploitation disguised as trade. But today, Ethiopia has said enough is enough. In boardrooms across the U.S., executives are scrambling. Starbucks, Dunkin', and countless independent roasters are facing an existential crisis. Their supply chains, once secured by Washington's dominance, are now collapsing. Analysts predict billions in losses. Coffee futures on the New York Stock Exchange have spiked beyond imagination. And in American households, panic is quietly brewing because coffee is not just a beverage, it is a cultural addiction. It is the fuel that drives Wall Street traders, Silicon Valley engineers, and Washington politicians. Remove coffee from America's bloodstream, and you paralyze the system. But let us not be deceived, Ethiopia's ban is not an impulsive act. It is a calculated, strategic decision aimed at dismantling a centuries-old imbalance. Ethiopia has watched how oil transformed the Middle East, how cobalt and coltan are reshaping the Democratic Republic of Congo's role in global trade, and now Ethiopia is ready to use its most valuable export to assert power. Coffee is no longer just a commodity, it is a weapon of sovereignty. The United States, of course, will attempt retaliation. Washington will cry foul at the World Trade Organization. It will threaten sanctions. It will send envoys with smiles and pressure behind closed doors. But the truth is simple. America is cornered. No amount of diplomatic sweet talk can change the fact that 40% of specialty coffee consumed in the U.S. originates from Ethiopia. There is no substitute for Ethiopian coffee because it is not just about caffeine, it is about taste, identity, and heritage. A latte without Ethiopian beans is a latte stripped of soul. The economic fallout inside America is just the beginning. Coffee shops that once flourished on every corner are shuttering. College students, Wall Street analysts, even blue-collar workers find themselves irritable, restless, unproductive. What may seem like a small inconvenience quickly snowballs into lost hours, declining creativity, and billions in economic output disappearing into thin air. America's economy, already fragile, cannot withstand such a blow. Meanwhile, Ethiopia is not suffering, it is thriving. Instead of sending its beans across the Atlantic to enrich U.S. corporations, Ethiopia has redirected its exports to Asia, the Middle East, and intra-African markets. China, India, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey have welcomed Ethiopian beans with open arms, paying premium prices and signing long-term agreements. In Africa, Ethiopia is forging new trade alliances, ensuring that its coffee nourishes its neighbors instead of fattening American profits. This shift is historic because it is not just Ethiopia acting alone. Other African nations are watching closely. If Ethiopia can stand up to the United States on coffee, then Ghana can do the same with cocoa, Nigeria with oil, Zambia with copper, and the Democratic Republic of Congo with cobalt. One bold act of defiance becomes the spark for continental awakening. For decades, Africa's resources flowed cheaply to the West, while Africans themselves lived in poverty. Now, Ethiopia's decision signals that those days are numbered. Make no mistake, Washington is terrified not because it has lost access to beans, but because it has lost control. America's power rests not on its military alone, but on its ability to dictate economic rules. And now, Ethiopia has flipped the table. The West, which once used sanctions to bully weaker nations, is now experiencing what it means to be economically cornered. For the first time in modern history, a nation long dismissed as developing is writing its own rules and forcing the U.S. to play catch-up. The cultural humiliation is equally severe. Coffee is not just America's drink, it is America's image. From Hollywood films showing executives clutching cups, to massive coffee chains dotting every city, coffee is tied to American identity. But imagine the humiliation when global headlines scream, U.S. cut off from coffee by Ethiopia. The world laughs, because the empire that once boasted about controlling oil in the Middle East cannot even secure its morning brew. And this is why Ethiopia's decision is revolutionary. It is a declaration that Africa will no longer be a passive supplier. It is a message that the West cannot continue to take without giving. It is a warning that those who once controlled the trade routes are now losing their grip. The Ethiopian government has explained its reasoning clearly. If coffee is going to leave its soil, it must be in a way that truly benefits Ethiopian farmers and the nation's development. Addis Ababa is demanding fair prices, technology transfer, and respect. The days of exploitation are over. By banning coffee exports to the U.S., Ethiopia is not simply punishing Washington, it is demanding dignity. Let us now turn to the American response. Already, the U.S. media is running stories blaming Ethiopia, painting the government as irrational, unstable, and dangerous. Politicians call it economic warfare. Some have even hinted at covert actions to destabilize Ethiopia's leadership. But the more Washington blusters, the more ridiculous it appears. Because at the end of the day, America cannot force Ethiopia to sell what Ethiopia refuses to sell. This is the new reality. Africa is no longer begging for aid. Africa is dictating terms, and Ethiopia has positioned itself as the spearhead of that transformation. Just as Ethiopia defeated Italian colonial forces at the Battle of Adwa in 1896, it is once again defeating a global empire not with guns and swords, but with beans and trade. History repeats itself, and once again Ethiopia stands as a symbol of African defiance and pride. Now, as we approach the heart of this crisis, the larger question looms. What comes next? Will the U.S. adapt, negotiate, and accept a new multipolar reality? Or will it double down on threats, sanctions, and destabilization? Ethiopia has already prepared for either outcome. Its alliances with China, Russia, and regional African powers mean it is not isolated. On the contrary, it is stronger than ever, and let us not forget coffee is only the beginning. If Ethiopia succeeds, it may expand similar policies to other crops, including sesame, pulses, and flowers. Other African countries may follow suit, banding together to create a united front that reshapes global trade forever. The age of cheap African exports feeding wealthy Western markets is ending. The age of Africa trading on its own terms has begun. This is the essence of the Ethiopian coffee ban. It is not merely economic. It is psychological. It forces America to confront a reality it has long ignored, that its dominance is slipping, and that nations it once dismissed are now capable of dictating terms. For the American consumer, it may seem like just an inconvenience. For the American economy, it is a shockwave. For the American empire, it is a warning. And so we arrive at the conclusion: Ethiopia's decision to ban coffee exports to the United States is not about denying a beverage. It is about asserting sovereignty, demanding respect, and rewriting the rules of global trade. It is about turning centuries of exploitation into a new era of equality. It is about showing Africa and the world that power no longer flows only from the West. The United States is left furious, humiliated, and scrambling for alternatives. But none of this changes the fact that Ethiopia has made history. By saying no, Ethiopia has done more than disrupt the coffee market, it has cracked the very foundation of American economic arrogance. The lesson is clear: the world is changing, Africa is rising, and Ethiopia has proven that even the smallest bean can bring an empire to its knees.